Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. My name's Simon Schretter. I'm Professor of History and Public Policy here in the History Faculty. It's an enormous pleasure for the last 3 days to be hearing Thomas Piketty here in Cambridge giving the Ellen MacArthur lectures. You will hopefully have all been introduced to them and to him twice now, so I'm not going to go on at great length about the content. He's very eloquent. You'll get all that from the horse's mouth in the next hour. Just to say a big thank you to all the staff of the Union Society, of the Lady Mitchell Hall, of the History Faculty, and my colleagues on the Ellen MacArthur Fund Management Committee for their work and their assistance in getting this here and getting us to this point. And I would like to say what an enormous pleasure it's been working with Thomas to bring him here. Wonderfully cooperative colleague who has always replied rapidly to all my pestering messages, and he's had a session with the doctoral students, he's had a session with master's students here, extremely generous with his time and his advice to both groups. So it's an absolute pleasure to have a really fully paid up human being who is also such an important figure in our world today. He he's a real proper historian. He understands the context of the past, he works at it, he researches it, but he's very committed also to the future. And he's thinking, we're used to the idea of a dialogue between the past and the present. That's what all history always is. Every historian is part of his own present and is researching the past to learn something that he doesn't already know. But Thomas is also bold enough to not only engage in a dialogue between the present and the past, but also very explicitly with the future. He is thinking about what we can learn from history to give our future a better chance, and our future is very precarious at the moment, as we all know. So, having founded History and Policy in 2002, 22 years ago, it was marvellous when I discovered his first book, which I wrote a review of. This is the Capital in the 21st Century, thinking, gosh, here's somebody who really, at great length, is using history to address policy in no uncertain terms. So it's been an enormous pleasure to talk with you over the last few days and to hear your lectures, and we look forward to the third one, which is happening right now.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you all for being here. So let me move on to this third lecture. These are the slides, so I hope you will be able to see them. So, you know, the third lecture is about socio-economic inequalities and political cleavages. So let me just remind you where we stand. So, you know, the first lecture was, I talked about the history of measurement, inequality measurement. The second lecture yesterday was about the historical movement toward more equality. And, you know, I tried to deliver this optimistic view of the long-run evolution of equality and inequality, you know, stressing that in the long run there's been a movement both toward more equality and more prosperity, and in particular through more equal access to education, more equal voting rights, you know, decolonization, and, you know, long-run movement which has brought us, you know, from the late 18th century and 19th century until today in a world which is precarious in many ways, but also much more equal than what it was in the past. And the way it happened was not through, you know, it didn't come from the sky, you know, it came from political mobilization, enormous social struggles and institutional transformation. And, I tried to show you yesterday that, the main lesson from all of this is that, equality is a struggle and it's a battle that can be won and that has been won in the past and that can be won in the future. But this requires enormous collective mobilization, and this process can continue, but only under certain conditions. So today we are going to look more at maybe some of the reason why this process, this historical movement toward more equality, has been to some extent interrupted in recent decades, although not entirely. There's still a movement toward more gender equality, racial equality, which to some extent is still going on. So it's not that all dimensions have been blocked together, but to some extent there's been some interruption in this historical process in some important dimensions, and we want to understand why. So the key question I'm going to be addressing today is to understand what in the structure of political cleavages and who votes for which political party, political forces, what has changed which can explain some of this situation. So the very general questions we're going to ask today from a social and historical research viewpoint is really who votes for whom and why over time. So very simple, descriptive historical question. But the bigger question behind the scene is really about the rise and fall and possible rebirth of what you can call the left-right class cleavage in politics, which, in the 20th century, I think was a very important component in the movement toward more equality. And so it's not that the left is always right and the right is always wrong or whatever. It's just that this dialectic confrontation on a class basis, in particular between the left and the right, has been a very important component of the process. I think, moving us towards the construction of the welfare state, the social state, and more generally the movement toward more equality. And this is this process that has sort of been broken down in a way in recent decades, and that's what we are trying to understand. So in order to make progress, there will be several steps in this presentation today. I'm going to start by telling you about a research program using post-electoral survey that we have conducted in recent years, where the general questions we're asking is to begin with very descriptive and simple. What do we know about the interaction between political cleavages and socio-economic inequality, its evolution over time. And so what we've done in this world political cleavage and inequality database, and you can look at this website online. You can also look, we wrote a synthesis article with Amaury Guettin, Clara Martinez-Tolenado that was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics 2022, Brahmin Left versus Merchant Right, Changing Political Cleavage in 21st Electoral Democracy, is that we try, what we do is pretty simple. Basically there are two ways, to study who votes for who. You can have either survey where you ask people, you have a representative sample of the population and you ask people, okay, what's your education, what's your occupation, what's your income, how did you vote for in the last election? And it's sort of the most direct way because you have individual level data on how people vote. The problem with this, and that's what we're going to start from, the World Political Cleavage Inequality Database is entirely based on this survey approach. The big limitation is that you don't have survey basically before the 1950s. So that's a big problem because it's interesting, I think, to understand some of today's problems that we encounter to go back to earlier in time, and in particular to the 19th century and the formation, before the 20th century left-right division ever existed, and so this you will never be able to do with survey. There's no survey. The only other problem with survey is that even for the recent period, they have limited sample size. You could also have people who have a retrospective voting attitude, which is not the way they voted, but usually when it's shortly after the election, it's okay. But the bigger problem is a limited sample size, which is that you cannot really look in a very granular way. If you want to combine many factors, education, income, wealth, age, gender, religion, plus where you stand on the territory, small cities, large city, villages, with a sample size of a few thousand people, that's just not going to work. And so the only way to do it is to use more granular data, local level data, and this is what we will move next. But to begin with, let me explain you a little bit more about this project. So in the World Political Cleavage and Inequality Database, we basically collected all post-electoral survey conducted since World War II. We cover 50 electoral democracies, so half of them are Western electoral democracy, half of them are outside the West, so we also cover India, Brazil, every country basically where there were elections and we could access electoral survey of reasonable quality with a reasonably good questionnaire on education, occupation, income, etc. And so we published a book which was published by Harvard University Press in 2021 called Political Cleavage and Social Inequalities, a study of 50 democracies 1948-2020. And there's a website, WPID.world, where you will find all the findings. So you can go online and you will be able to compare countries. We try to update it as soon as there are new elections. And so that's what we do. And so what do we find? So one of the big findings we find is what we call, the emergence of a multiple elite party system in Western democracy, and in particular at the end of the period, the fact that we have this idea of the higher educated voter tend to vote for the left, and this is what we call the Brahmin left, and the higher income voters keep voting for the right, so what we call the merchant right, and so we have this sort of division of different form of elite, so which we didn't have before. So in the 50s, 60s, 70s, in fact, all the elite, whether it's high education, high income, high wealth, whatever the dimension of social stratification, they will vote more strongly for right-wing party. And it was sort of the definition, in a way, of the left and the right in terms of who votes for them. And again, this doesn't mean that the people in the bottom are always right and the people at the top are always wrong. I think, both all social class and all social experience have something to bring to the democratic table of conversation. And, the people who are poor, they have certain things to bring. People who have been more successful for all sorts of reasons have also something to bring. So we all have our own voting attitude, and I tend to vote more for the left than for the right, to be clear. But, that's not it. My feeling is that, we want really to understand how electoral democracy can work and how, the alternance in power of different political sides can help in the end have a sort of a useful collective policy work for everybody. And this kind of dialectics that we had in the 50s, 60s, I think was sort of working, or at least this is the time where, electoral democracy, the building up of the welfare state, everything seemed to go hand in hand and in a way, in a smoother way than today. And I think part of the reason why it's more complicated today has to do with this sort of multiple elite system, which, just to be clear, so, we use the term Brahmin left, which, so, we are using this terminology which is sort of referring, to what is sometimes called a trifunctional society or ternary societies in the past, which you have in India with the Brahmin, which was the educated elite, the clergy class historically, as opposed to the Kshatriya, which was the warrior class. Now, of course, you have that also in medieval Europe with the clergy and the nobility, so sort of two forms of elite, a sort of intellectual elite, the clergy. So Cambridge, I understand, was actually training, member of the clergy, and the majority of the graduates from Cambridge were working for the church or working in monasteries up until the middle of the 19th century. So this was, historically the clergy was the intellectual class. So today, the clergy is a very small group, but we have another intellectual class, which is typically the PhD class. So in the US right now, we have about 3% of the electorate, 3% of the electorate with a PhD. So, this is a serious social class. This is not, this is like the clergy, the size of the clergy in the late 18th century. So it's not completely uncomparable. And, historically, this division in ternary societies, you have the clergy, you have the nobility with sort of in charge of keeping order and making war and have a particular specialization in basically order and police and as opposed to the intellectual class. And each elite in the sort of traditional ternary system is supposed to put limit to one another, and so the priests, the clergy, they are not supposed to govern instead of the nobility, but the nobility are supposed to listen to the wise advice of the clergy and intellectual, and this is sort of this long-standing conflict between intellectuals who would like decision makers to have a little bit of respect for their knowledge and listen to their wise advice. And so each group has a different legitimacy to govern in a way. So we are not saying that today's situation is exactly like this, but we think the comparison is not completely uninteresting and meaningless. And what I want to stress is that this division between these two kinds of elite is really something new. So, sometimes people have a feeling, okay, intellectuals have always been on the left, so there's nothing new. No, in fact, this is new. So in the 50s, 60s, people with a master's degree or a PhD degree, but they were very few, but if you take them, they were voting much more for the conservative, for the right, than people with a bachelor, who were voting more to the right than people with high school, who were voting more to the right than people with a primary school. So the gradient of the vote with respect to education was going the other way. I mean, of course, you can always find individual exceptions of left intellectuals, but on average, the gradient with respect to education in the 50s, 60s was that the more educated you are, the more you vote to the right. And the wealthier you are, the more you vote to the right. So the gradient was the same in every dimension of social stratification. Whereas today, the gradient goes in different directions. So just to make clear what this graph means, what this means is that for a given income, when you're more educated, you vote more for the left, and for a given education, when you have a higher income, you vote more for the right. Now, if you have both high education and high income, because there's a positive correlation, of course, between the two dimensions, then you are a bit lost about where is your loyalty and who do you vote for. So the clearest case are when you have high income, high education, low income. So if you have, I gave the example yesterday, so let me give it again. If you have a PhD in sociology with very low income, you will really vote a lot for the left. If you're a real estate millionaire with very low education, you will vote a lot for the right. So that's that's really these two examples of the poor sociologist voting for the left and the rich Donald Trump voting for the right is sort of the typical example that you would have in mind of what I call here by multiple elite. So this resonates, probably familiar to you, but what's important to see is that this comes from a long historical evolution. It's not something that has always been there. And so what we are going to try to understand is why did it change and what are the implications for the next steps. And first of all, let me say that this graph, so this particular graph comes from so this is an average over all Western electoral democracies. You have the list of countries, Australia, Britain, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, etc., etc. But you find it country by country, and you will get all if you go to the website, you will get everything. So here, this graph comes from the synthesis paper, Bramin-Lev versus Merchant Right, Changing Political Cleavage over 21 Western electoral democracies. But you get it everywhere in the West. So let me give you some examples of countries which US, Britain, France. It's very striking that, so this is the same graph for the education gradient. So this is, again, so this is the difference. So if you take the blue line, which is the vote for the Democratic Party in the US, this is how much the Democratic Party is getting among the top 10% education group versus the bottom 90%. It will work the same if you do the top 50, bottom 50, it will, no matter how you slice the data, it will work this way. And so you can see that when you're negative, when you're below zero, it means that the top educated vote less for you than the bottom, so they vote more for the Republican, for the other side. So in the 50s, 60s, the top educated were voting more for the Republican, and at the end of the period, that's the same. And you can see that, France, US, UK, very different political system, very different history of political parties. You have basically the same evolution, very striking. And we find this for other countries. It's interesting to see, France and US are actually closer to each other than Britain, which is lagging behind a little bit, which is interesting because it shows that the Labour Party historically in Britain was particularly working class, as compared to Democratic Party in the US, which maybe you will not be surprised, but also that the left-wing party, which in practice in France is a combination of socialist communist party mostly, so France has a lot of imagination to invent new parties all the time. I understand that this country is having quite a lot of imagination now in recent years, but France is far ahead in terms of inventing new parties all the time. But here I put all of them together so as to compare to US Democratic Party and British Labour Party. But so, Britain's Labour Party is sort of lagging behind a little bit the evolution. So you start more working class and it takes more time to become more Brahmin left. But in the end, this goes in the same direction. So this is just the raw data without any control. If you include a control for income and control for age and control for gender, so looking at the residual effect of education, the curves moves up a little bit because controlling for income, the effect of education is even more to the left, but the trend is the same. So, without control, you have the same evolution for all countries. So it's very, very strong. And if you look at it in a more granular way, comparing primary school diploma, secondary school diploma, short higher education, long higher education, you move really from a curve that is increasing monotonically with income, you vote more for the right, to a curve that gradually reverses, and then you get the opposite at the end, where the more educated vote more for the left. So again, in Britain, it took more time. So Britain remained more working class. I mean, you can see in 1945, British Labour Party is really much more. They don't have a lot of vote in the most educated people. Remember, it was also a difficult transition from the liberal versus conservative to Labour versus conservative. And remember, someone like Keynes, who would say, I will never vote for Labour. I will always vote liberal because, Labour is. Well, first, they don't have good economists, they don't have good Brahmins, they don't have good university professors, they are sort of working class barbarians. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but, there was this, probably, of course, Keynes disappears when Labour gets to power, and probably if he had remained until 60s, 70s, 80s, he would have become a Labour Party Brahmin like many others, but, it's historically, the Labour Party in Britain is certainly more working class than in this example. Now, it's less working class if you compare it to Sweden or Norway. Sweden and Norway will be even below Labour Party, but still the same evolution. So you have interesting variation between countries which are sort of what you expect, but the general evolution is the same. Let me say also that this evolution, in a way, is very close to what was predicted in the 50s by someone, Simon, that you know quite well, which is Michael Young, who wrote so with this famous British sociologist, who wrote in 1958 this book called The Rise of the Meritocracy, which is an anticipation novel which ends actually about today, in 2033, when the story that Michael Young, if you've not read this book, this is a very funny anticipation novel written by a sociologist. So Michael Young was a British sociologist very close to the Labour Party in the 50s and very concerned about educational stratification in the UK, which is, of course, a very serious concern, and the possibility that Labour somehow don't manage to democratize sufficiently well the educational system and get into a sort of hypocritical meritocratic ideology. So in the view of Michael Young, the rise of the meritocracy is something very negative. It's just a way to explain to the poor that they don't have skills, they don't have merit, they are, unfit to do anything qualified. And so the concern of of Michael Young will be that there will be a rise of a populist party, that will be against the conservative, of course, because conservative are, aristocrat people, very privileged, but also against the Labour Party, because the risk was that the Labour Party will become, in the terms of Michael Young, a party of technicians, so not the very higher educated, but sort of intermediate educated people. And in the end, they will have so much disdain for the uneducated that the very poor, or bottom 50% of society will feel that they are being looked down by both the historical aristocrats and the new technicians of the Labour Party. And so they would escape, go to some kind of populist party. And so the book is written by a sort of journalist sociologist who finally in 2033 dies in the middle of a riot, a populist riot, and this is the end of the novel. And so you should read it if you have not read it, because it's sort of fun. Well, not so fun, but now in a way the reality went even beyond what Michael Young had in time, because in his view of 1958, he could not imagine that the very higher education would turn Labour rather than conservative. So, he thought Labour will be the technician party. So the real, Oxbridge graduate will still vote conservative, and Labour will be the party of the people, with sort of short higher education degree, something like this. So in fact, the reality went even beyond this, because in the end, Labour, even in the top 10% education is doing better than conservative. So this is the sort of big picture that we have, and this is not only, US, UK, France, this is general. So where does this come from, and what can we do about that? So let me make first a number of points. First, this is something we find in all Western electoral democracies, but not in other parts of the world. So if you take a country like India, let me make clear that the Brahmin, the real Brahmin in India, they don't vote for left at all. They vote for BJP, so, nationalist, pro-business party. So in a way, the structure of the political conflict in India, in Brazil, and in many countries outside the West looks much more like class conflict than in the West today. In the sense that in India, both the high education and high income and high wealth vote a lot more for the BJP than for the Congress and party to the left of Congress. And same for Brazil, if you compare voting for the Lula or Bolsonaro party, the different dimensions of political, social stratification are much more aligned than in the West. So this is really a Western evolution. And so what's the main explanation for this, and how can we, get out of this? Well, so, the general explanation that we are trying to push in general is that it's, it's probably both a supply side and a demand side problem, as economists will say. So it comes both from the evolution of political parties themselves and the evolution of the electorate and the demand of the electorate. But we feel that the supply side, so the political parties themselves have a big responsibility. So to put it short, maybe the Labour Party or Social Democratic Party, Socialist Party, Democratic Party have sort of stopped being very redistributive in what they propose. And so, well, yes, they have lost touch with the most unfavored part of the electorate, just because, it's not that the electorate does not understand, it's that they understand very well that the policies that are being proposed are not really in their favor anymore. So that's, the general explanation that we tend to favor, and we feel that if you don't have a quite radical change in the policy platform and much more redistribution of income, wealth, education, economic democracy, that's not going to change. So that's a general picture. Now, within this general picture, what I want to stress is that this evolution is such a long-run evolution, and it's not something that was decided. It's not as if three people in a room at the headquarters of the Labour Party suddenly decided, okay, we are going to become a Brahmin party. It didn't happen like this. So this is a very sort of entrenched situation, which is also the consequence, partly unintended, there are choices that are made by political leaders, militants. There is influence of lobbying, financing of think tank, financing of the media. So some people know very well what they do, but it's also partly the unintended consequences of the democratization of education. So when you expand the share of the population going to higher education from 1% 50 years ago to 50%, 60% in the new generation, you really completely transform the sort of political landscape and sort of anthropological landscape of what it means to be higher educated. Because it's not anymore a very small elite, it becomes even the majority of the young generation. And those who are not in this majority, can feel in the end that they are sort of looked down by those who have made it, and because historically the left parties have made educational expansion and emancipation through education so much the cornerstone of what they believe. If you are sort of lagging behind in education for all sorts of reasons, it can be quite aggressive for you. And I think the concern of Michael Young in the 1950s is how do you build real equality in access to education, and you don't build a sort of new meritocratic ideology that is sort of blaming the losers basically of the system, is a real challenge. And so there's a real challenge. It's partly unintended. It's also that the occupational structure with respect to the educational structure has changed so much, has become more complex, and there could be, in the long run, you could imagine sort of good reason why you could have my fellow Frenchman philosopher Bruno Latour in his latest book wrote about what he calls the rise of the ecological class, which he views as sort of the equivalent of the working class of the 20th century, but for the 21st century. You could imagine that this, and for him this means a sort of green conscious ecological class, you could imagine in the very long run, if 100% of the population goes to higher education, that you have the ecological class could be made of people who consciously choose less lucrative occupation out of high education, and the sort of merchant class is maybe less ecologically conscious, as equally high education, or could have lower education in some case, more MBA, less PhD, but higher income because they should more lucrative, more extractivist occupation. And then you could have this kind of conflict in a way that is not necessarily bad, so to speak. It could sort of make sense as a new evolution of politics. Except that we are not in a world with 100% of the population goes to higher education. It's, even if it's 50% for the new generation, you still have 50% who don't. And if you take the whole population, it's a lot more. And so the view of Latour of the ecological class, can very much be described also as the sort of new elite, and from which the rest of the population who are not in the high education class, high income class, feel completely excluded. And that's, of course, the big risk we face today. So where do we move from there? And we want to sort of better understand these issues. So unfortunately, I will say, as I say, there are limits to what we can learn from this post-electoral survey. In particular, some of the time variations that you could see on the previous graph are just due to small sample size, so don't spend too much time trying to understand the difference from one election to the other, because it's just lots of sample size problem with surveys. So, the general trend are okay, but if you want to study in a more granular manner this transformation, and also if you want to study longer time period, you need to use other kind of data. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the lecture is I will focus on a presentation of this book, which is a book that we published with Julia Cagé in France in 2023. That's going to come out this year at Harvard University Press, but it's not out yet, so you have to read French, sorry about this, but it will soon be in French. It will soon be in English. I should apologize that some of the graph and figures I will show are actually in the French version, but anyway, you cannot read anything, so that's not a problem. And I will try to describe what's on the figure. This is part of a broader research project. So basically, we did in the World Political Cleavage and Equality Database, we cover 50 countries, but only with post-electoral survey. which is sort of reasonably easy to access to, so you can cover 50 countries quite easily. I mean, it's not too complicated. This requires a lot more work, because here we collect, we had to digitize data from archives at the municipality level for all elections in France since the French Revolution. So this is also a lot more interesting than just working with the survey. But, we cannot cover 50 countries like this. So it took us many years to do it for one country. And now we are doing it for the US. I will talk about the British case later. We have PhD students extending it to other countries, but it will take time to have as many countries. So summing up, what do we learn from this book on France? And I will show you the data and results more in a minute. General message, in a way you can say is sort of obvious, but I think it's important. The left-right class cleavage, is a very complex and fragile historical construction. And the key issue is that you need to put together very different lower class voters in the same coalition, irrespective of geography, sector, origins, religion, gender, which is something very difficult, because the rural poor, the urban poor, they are all very different in terms of aspiration. But it's always been like that. The good news is that, okay, it's complicated today, but it has always been complicated, and it has always been a very complex construction. So why did it work? When did it work? Well, you need some kind of very powerful unifying ideology and platform, which, Labour Party, Socialist Party trade union were able to provide, but it took them a very long time, moving from the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, in particular to try to convince the rural poor, and in particular the self-employed and people tied to agriculture, that, in the end, they have more in common with the urban poor than with the rural elite, which, it took a very, very long time. It was a very complicated process. It's not something, class consciousness is not something that sort of happens just like this. It's a construction that has really to do with the party network, militants. It's very complex. So this was made possible, in the 20th century. But, if we want this to be possible again, we'll have to have equally powerful collective mobilization organization if we want to escape from this sort of conflict of elite between the Brahmin left and merchant right, which is sort of a conflict between liberals and nationalists, which look a little bit also like liberal and conservative, or Orleanist and legitimist, as we would say in my country in the 19th century. And to me, this is really the worst of all situations. But, to escape from this will require sort of very specific conditions. What I will stress in the, maybe our main conclusion from the book is that, conflict about origins, migrants, non-migrants, so, the migrant poor, the non-migrant poor, conflict going with religion in some cases, and, how, the rise of Islam in France, Britain, Germany, even though it's just less than 10% of the population, this has made everybody crazy. Well, not everybody, but lots of people crazy. And so the conflict between the migrant poor, the non-migrant poor, the conflict over religion is, of course, part of the difficulty. But what we argue in this book with Julia is that, in fact, that's probably not the most important one. The most important one is more socio-economic and, in particular, territorial, between the gap in voting pattern between people in rural and small cities versus large cities, irrespective of origin, even if you have no migrant of any kind, and that's not the issue, has increased in recent decades to a level that we had never seen since the 19th century. And to us, that's really the key question we need to ask. And we believe it has much more to do with the changing occupational structure, exposure to international competition, with people in the services in large cities, less exposed to international competition than manufacturing employment, which is now more located in small cities, access to higher education, to public infrastructure, which is more difficult in small cities, access to property, home ownership, which is actually easier in small cities. So, all these different dimensions have sort of regained power in a way that can be addressed. I mean, the good news is that, socio-economic cleavages about access to public services, access to home ownership, access to jobs, international trade competition, these are complicated challenges, but they can be addressed. Whereas if you portray everything in terms of, the fight over identity, migrant versus non-migrant poor, what's the solution exactly, except a huge fight, is not very clear. But the conclusion of our work is that, in fact, some people gain by stressing this identity conflict, but this is not really what's going on, in particular with the Le Pen electorate, which I will talk more. Okay, so first, let me go back a little bit in the French historiography, because in fact, what we're doing, the key question is about how the rural poor versus the urban poor are voting. This is going to be sort of one of the key questions we're asking, and this is a question that cannot be really well answered with survey, because you don't have sufficiently many observations, and you cannot go back to the 19th century, which you need to go back. So in particular, in France, everything starts with the French Revolution, at least in terms of early politicization and how people vote in the 19th century. And one of the big questions is, why do the peasants, or at least part of the peasants, not all, vote for the right? And that's a big question, so there are two fantastic books on this, one book by Paul Bois in 1960 and one book by Charles Tilly in 1964. So, Charles Tilly wrote many other books later on sort of broader issues and the history of capitalism, state formation, etc. This book is only about, a tiny French department in Vendée. This was his PhD thesis. To me, this is his best book by far. I mean, other books are good also, but this one is just incredible. And the book by Paul Bois was written independently on another department, Sarthe, which is a little bit above in the map of Western France, so it's very close, but it's not exactly the same setting. And they all reach very similar conclusion about the key question of why some peasants turn right-wing after the French Revolution. And so that's the key, the key explanation by Paul Bois is the following. The idea is that, in 1789, peasants were actually very strongly mobilized to get rid of elite power, nobility. So, the idea, because, one explanation for why they turn right-wing will be, Marx in 1848, in his famous book on the 1848 election, basically was very upset against peasants, and his big explanation is, okay, peasants are just conservative people, they are backward, he has terrible sentences about the peasant world. The problem with this explanation is that, in fact, peasants and peasant revolt in particular were at the origin of the French Revolution. So if you look at Cahiers de Doléances, these peasants, they wanted to get rid of the nobility, wanted to get rid of the monasteries, they wanted to get land ownership, they were sort of the most revolutionary of all, and without them, the revolution would not have happened. So, you cannot say they're just backward and that's it. So the more subtle explanation, which both Paul Bois and Charles Tilly are going to come with, and which is more socio-economic and political, is that, in fact, these people are very revolutionary to begin with, but then, so why do so many peasants turn against the revolution, in particular in 1793, and this is going to get really ugly, is that, what he looks, when he looks with a sort of microscope and a very detailed way at the department of Sarthe, is really that you have two very different attitudes of peasants. Basically, you have in the west of the department, where you have mostly ecclesiastical property historically, then the peasants are going to turn to the right. But in the east of the department, where you have more aristocratic property historically, they are going to remain more pro-republican, more to the left. Now, why is it so? Well, that's very surprising at first sight, because if you look at Cahiers de Doléances, initially, it's sort of the opposite. I mean, they were all very anti-nobility, anti-clergy. But the people on the west, on the ecclesiastical property side, were actually even more, revolutionary in a way. So why do they turn to the right? The explanation of Paul Bois is that they are just very disappointed by what happened during the French Revolution, and in particular because what the French Revolution is going to do, is to expropriate the clergy, basically, something Britain did 2 centuries and a half before, but the French Revolution does it, at that time, and it's, basically about 25% of the land and the wealth of the country belonged to the church at the time. This was just wiped out entirely to solve the public debt problem, if you want to summarize what happens. But then this land is going not, so the landless peasants, imagine that they're going to get the land. They think, well, this is what the revolution is supposed to do. In fact, this is not at all what the revolution is going to do, because the revolution, they could have gotten rid of the public debt in other ways, and, I would certainly have advised them to do so, but that's not what they did. What they do is to auction the land of the church to those who have the financial means to buy the land. So typically, urban bourgeoisie, or people with cash, or actually people who have some public debt. So basically it's a swap between the public debt and the ecclesiastical land. They transfer some of the ecclesiastical land to those who had public debt. And the people who had nothing at all, they still have nothing at all. So there's a little bit of land redistribution, but very, very little. It's not like the land reform of the 20th century where you say, okay, people over 200 hectares have to give up their land, people below 5 hectares get a piece of land. You never have a formula like this at the time. And in practice, okay, there are lots of variation across departments over time, but most of the landless peasants don't get anything. And so the peasants on the west of the Sarthe department are particularly disappointed because they see the land going to the urban bourgeoisie. They see the clergy being expropriated, but they don't benefit from it. Whereas in the east of the department, the aristocrats are still there, keep the land for the most part, and so the peasants are still very upset against the aristocrats, and they still vote for the left, basically, or they vote for the Republic. And now Charles Tilly look at the case of Maine-et-Loire and Vendée, which is just 150 kilometers to the south of Sarthe, so it's not, but it's still a different setting, and basically finds the same kind of setting. To me, the most beautiful part in this research is that they are able to combine lots of socioeconomic data on land ownership with actual political perceptions and political discourse, which are in particular are expressed in the register of the electoral assemblies, because the way the new electoral system set up by the French Revolution would work is that people would so first, just to put the bigger question into a broader, in the early 1780s, you have 6 million voters in France, which at the same time in Britain it's like 200,000. So it's really another scale. You have 80% of adult males, so women cannot work, of course, and domestic servants cannot work. But apart from that, 70 to 80% of adult males can vote, which this is the first time ever in history that 6 million, 7 million of the people are called to vote. And they don't all vote because it's complicated. You need to go to the assembly, but you have participation of 40, 50%, which is not bad given the condition of the time. And they meet first in electoral assembly at the head of the county, the head of the canton, and then they decide their representative at the level of the department. And so when they meet first at the level of the head of the canton, you have actually this register who sort of describe, you don't have all the speeches, but you have a lot of records about what people say, how they organize the deliberation, and this is the material that Bois Tilly are using, and so they really have a lot of material. They use the Cahiers de doléances, which are these books where people say, I want the land from the church, I want the land from the nobility. So, this perception that I was describing and summarizing are not just invented. There's actually a lot of material to study them, and that's why these are, I think, very beautiful books. I should also say that Bois and Tilly give a very different view of the matter than an other author which you might not know, but which I still want to mention, which is Siegfried, which is sort of the first inventor of electoral geography in French political science, in a way, who in 1913 wrote a different kind of book. I mean, in a way, it's closer to what we do in our book with Julia, because he collects all the canton level, so not communal level, but canton level, so the county level, electoral data. But as compared to Bois and Tilly, this is, I think, less interesting because, well, first he has a shorter time period. Basically, he looks at the Third Republic, 1871 to 1910. So he doesn't really look at the French Revolution. And he has a sort of very, I think, conservative way, in a way, to explain the conservative vote of the peasants. Well, himself, Siegfried is a Republican, but Republican, sort of center-right. He doesn't like the monarchist conservative, but he doesn't like at all the socialists. So he's very in the center. And he actually tried to become a member of parliament, and he lost 3 times against conservative, monarchist, and his theory is that these people have still too much influence on poor peasants, and poor peasants are just being captured by the traditional rural elite. So that's his view, because he lost the election, and that's sort of his view. But in fact, it doesn't work very well. So we retook the data, and in fact, what we find is much closer to the Bois-Tilly interpretation, in the sense that the places with the largest level of wealth concentration, land concentration, typically tied to aristocratic property that was not expropriated during the revolution, actually tend to vote more to the left. So inequality has more a mobilizing effect for the left than a sort of capture effect that Siegfried is. Okay, I could do the entire lecture on this, but I want to show you more of what we've done in our book. But this is, I wanted to have this discussion because this is to say, like what I tried to tell you in my first lecture on the history of inequality measurement, that we are all part of a long chain of research, and as far as we are concerned in this book, we feel that we are sort of continuing this discussion of Siegfried 1913, Bois-Tilly 1960. So this might be very far away from English historiography, and these are sort of very questions that are very tied to the French Revolution. But the bigger question, which is why the rural poor don't always vote with the urban poor, I think has a much broader interest. So what do we do exactly in this book, and what do we find? I know this time is not the right time, so I have a good excuse to be much longer than what I'm supposed to be, but let's try not to be... how long more am I supposed to... 10 minutes, yeah, for this book, it's 800 pages, so that's...
I give you 50.
Yeah, it's exactly what I need. Okay, good. So, no, but I'm happy that I spent time on Bois and Tilly, because in a way, that's more interesting than our book, whatever. So let me try still to summarize. So let me go very fast, just to say, this is the kind of material, archival materials that we use. So these are electoral registers. So here, this is for 1849 legislative election. So as you can see, it's quite dirty writing. You have the name of the candidate, the number of votes. So you're not going to put an artificial intelligence to do the work for you. Basically, that's all by hand. We use some research assistant, but then in order to code the candidate into political parties, that's something we did ourselves with Julia, looking at the local press in particular, because you don't have political parties directly in this register. So you need to work with the local press of the time to actually put political affiliation to this candidate. So the document looks really difficult, when you have in 1849. You see, in 1910, they look a bit better. So we are putting the canton of Cambrai, which is where Julia's grandparents are, in the north of France. But you have similar documents all over the country. Now, the good thing, is that in France, you have 36,000 communes, which are more or less stable since the French Revolution. So what we do, sorry, this is in French, we collect this kind of data for the 36,000 municipalities of France for every legislative election from 1848 to 2022, every presidential election from 1848 to 2022, and a number of key referendums, 1793, 1795, 1946, 1992, 2005 on Europe. Let me just say that before our work, the Interior Ministry in France had digitized this data, but starting only with the legislative election of 2002. So before 2002, this had never been done. So people who were working with electoral data in France were working at the level of the département or sometimes the constituency, but it's too big really to see who's voting for whom, because you have rich people, poor people. Whereas we have a much more granular... So, okay, all the data is online. So you have this website called unehistoireduconflitpolitique.fr. It will be soon translated into English, but, you can, it's very easy to understand if you're interested. And you will get all the files starting from there with the municipality level for all election, including the socio-demographic data. So you want to do other stuff than we've done, and we've done maybe 3% of what can be done with this data. Please do it. That's online, so that's a resource of a research resource for everybody. So just to give you a sense of the granularity of the data, here you have a map on average income per municipality in France in 2022. So average income in France per municipality in 2022 is about 19,200 euros per inhabitant, including children. So here this is all fiscal income. So this excludes if you have retained earnings in a corporation, this is not included. So it's an underestimate of income, especially for rich people. But already it varies enormously. So the average for France is 19k euros per individual, including the children. But in a poor city like Roubaix in the north of France, it will be 8,900 euros. So, per month, this is per year, of course. So this is per month, it's going to be 700 euros per inhabitant, so that's not very large. If you go to the 7th arrondissement of Paris, which is the most affluent place in Paris, the average is going to be almost 110,000 euros, so 10,000 euros per month, including the children. Okay, so if you have a couple with 2 children, it's 40k per month average income. So, okay, so you can have some poor people there, but you cannot have too many poor people in the 7th arrondissement. And in Roubaix, you can have some rich people, but you cannot have too many rich people. Okay, because so this is just saying that the data is so granular, and in every part of the country, in the Bordeaux agglomeration, Lille, Marseille, you're going to find some very expensive, very rich little suburbs and some very poor ones. So you can look at, this is even, so our second indicator of wealth is going to be real estate value. So what's the average value of a house? And we observe this very well since the French Revolution, because the French Revolution puts in place a tax system where the real estate value is sort of the cornerstone of the tax system, so they register very well the value. Very little inflation at the time until World War I, so very well registered. And after that, you have good data up until today where you have all the real estate transactions. Just to get the orders of magnitude, average housing value in France right now is around 200k, 219,500 in 2022. If you go to Vierzon in the Cher, which will be, in the sort of middle west of the country, it will be 65k. So you get a house for 65k. If you go to the 7th arrondissement of Paris, you need 1.2 million. So, I guess in Britain, you would have, between London and other, So that's what we're exploiting. And so how do we exploit it? So let me start with a very simple graph. So le vote ensemble est-il le plus bourgeois de l'histoire? So what is ensemble? Ensemble is the name of the Macron coalition in 2022. This is the name, so they change the name of their political parties all the time. In France we sort of reinvent political names all the time. But voters know who they are. They know how to recognize them. So what do we do here? We rank municipalities by average income, top 1%, top 5%, top 10%, and all the way to the bottom 10%. You can also do it by percentile. It's weighted by population. So when we say top 1%, this is the equivalent of the 1% of total adult population in France who lives in the highest income municipality. So typically it can be the 7th arrondissement of Paris. And we see the electoral score obtained by this party, we always express as a ratio of the national average, so that you see, as compared to your national average score, where do you get your highest scores? And, okay, the bottom line, okay, so is Ensemble the most bourgeois in history? Well, in fact, it's just as bourgeois as the traditional right-wing vote, in a way. So, droite in French means right-wing. So this is the right-wing vote for different elections, but you can check all elections, it will be the same. The first strong regularity is that wealthiest municipalities always vote a lot more for the right than their average score. So you can see Macron in 2022, 170% means that on average, in the top 1% municipalities, they got 1.7 times their average electoral score in the average of the country. So Macron looks a little bit like the traditional right-wing vote historically, except that in the bottom, is doing even worse because historically the right-wing votes were able to get some of the rural poor, which Macron doesn't manage to get at all. So in the end, if you look at the entire slope, it's even a bit more, even a bit steeper for Macron. But in the end, it's not so different. So we start the book with this graph, which I guess people in power in France were not very happy with this graph. But we're trying to be descriptive in this book and to try to see if we can make comparison over time. And so we make systematic comparison over time of who votes for whom. We look at electoral participation. So electoral participation in France, you have to distinguish presidential elections from legislative election. Presidential election participation is still about 75-80% in the latest election. For legislative elections, there's been a big decline, 50% in the last election. Now, what's striking, this is not new, this is well known. What's new is this, where we look at the differential participation between rich and poor municipalities. And so if you look at the green curve, this is the ratio of participation between the 50% richest, the upper half of the population living in the richest municipalities and the bottom half. And you can see, and blue is for the top 5% versus bottom 5% and so on. So you can see that in recent election, the gap in participation between the richest and the poorest municipality has grown to a level that we had basically never seen. Note that in the 70s, 80s, the gap goes actually in the other side, which means that the poorest municipalities were actually voting more than the richest municipalities. So that's important because it shows that, the idea that the poor are always vote less than the rich is in fact wrong. It depends on the mobilization strategy of political parties. So in particular in the 70s, 60s, you have a strong vote for the Communist Party in lower income places. So, depending on the mobilization strategy, it can be the opposite. We should not sort of naturalize or essentialize the idea that, okay, the poor are always less mobilized than the rich. It varies, and as you can see, it can vary quite fast. In a few decades. So why is it that the poor stopped voting in recent decades? Well, our interpretation is probably because they felt the platform that was proposed by the left and the right looked a lot the same, and they felt they would just stay at home. The good news is that, if they were enthusiastic about the Le Pen platform, they would all vote like crazy. You would have 90% participation. In fact, many of them, and most of them in the poorest municipality, just stay at home. And they are just not happy with what's being proposed. I don't know if it's good news, but it shows at least that there may be a demand for something else. Now, if we look at the pattern of who votes for whom, and, let me, go fast because I know I've already passed my time. Probably the most important result is the evolution of the territorial cleavage. So here we divide the geography of France into villages, which are people living in small municipalities, agglomeration of less than 2,000 inhabitants, bourgs, which are sort of small cities in blue, where it's between 2,000 and 100,000, which is about a quarter of the population today. And then in agglomeration over 100,000 inhabitants, we have what we call the metropolis, which is sort of the city center, and banlieue, which is the suburbs of the large agglomeration. Why do we put this threshold? Well, because today this sort of divides the population into sort of 4 quarters. You have about 1/4 of the population in villages, 1/4 in bourgs, 1/4 in suburbs, 1/4 in metropolis. Of course, in the 19th century, the large agglomeration over 100,000 inhabitants are just like 1 or 2% of the population, and the bourg, which gave rise to the bourgeois, the notion of bourgeois, are actually the largest municipality of the time. So these categories have changed over time, and I will show you in a minute another way to look at the data and take this into account. But for now, what do you see here? Well, you see that villages have always voted more to the right than average of the population. So you will say, okay, we already knew that, small cities prefer the right, but it's good to start from the obvious in order to see then the historical transformation. And after all, This is the first time I think we have a sort of rigorous long-term measure of this, where, if you're looking for regularity in social sciences, it's sort of striking that in 45 electoral, in 45 legislative election, it's always, the green curve is always above 1. Now you can see in the recent election, what's very striking is that the gap is really rising very fast. So another way, and maybe more comparable over time to do that, is to use percentiles, so to have a fixed fraction of the population in each group. So here, if you look at the green curve, this is the ratio between how much you vote for the right-wing parties in the 50% most rural part of the country and the 50% most urban. So again, the green curve is always above 1. But, for a long time, in most of the 20th century, and in particular in the post-World War II period, it was actually very close to 1. So if you take the election of Mitterrand in 1981, which was a typical left-right election, Mitterrand against Giscard, Mitterrand is getting almost the same score in small villages and large agglomeration. The ratio is like 1.02. Whereas today, the ratio has increased a lot and is back to a level that basically we never had seen since the 19th century. So, that's a key result, sort of that this division between the rural poor and the urban poor, and in terms of vote for the left and the right, because that's the two are very strongly related, has returned to levels that had never been seen before. We actually have put the 2024, because the French also voted in 2024 after our book was published in 2023, and this evolution is continuing. So here we have put the result for the European election of 2024, but it is exactly the same for the legislative election. So again, this is the ratio between the vote, well, here this is looking at it the other way, which is the vote for the left in the most 50% most urban part of the country and the 50% most rural part of the country. And in the latest election of 2024, you have a ratio of 1.4, which is really enormous, because you cut the country into two halves. The most urban, the most rural. Within each of these two halves, you have lots of poor, lots of rich municipalities, lots of differences, and the fact that you have such a big ratio means that the territorial gap, has become, 1.4 is really incredibly large. It's basically the kind of gap you had at the time of 1848, and when, Marx was very angry with the fact that the rural poor were not voting for the left or the urban poor. So we are sort of back to this kind of very strong territorial gap in political attitude between the rural world and the urban world. And the key question is why. So this is what we keep studying in the rest of the book. Let me move, accelerate and look at the evolution of the geographical, so here what we call the sort of rural basculement, so the rural shift of the vote for Le Pen. So, the Le Pen party, Jean-Marie the father, Marine the daughter, had two different names, FN, Front National, RN, Rassemblement National. They have changed their name, but this is the same party. So let's call it FN, RN. And here, let's look at the scores they get in villages, bourgs, suburbs, municipalities, and metropolis. Now, what's very striking is that this has become a rural vote, very strongly so, but it was not at all like this historically. So here Le Pen first participated to the presidential election in 1974, but he was the chief of staff of Tixier-Vignancourt in 1965, which was a sort of French Algeria candidate to the election of 1965, so nationalist right. I mean, Le Pen himself was a volunteer to fight in French Algeria to keep Algeria in France. So that's a very important part of the whole story and the conflict with the Muslim Algerians, some of them now in France. So I put Tixier because, in fact, at the beginning, both the Tixier vote in 1965 and the Le Pen vote in 1974 are really urban vote, and pretty well off. And it continues like this, and then you have a complete change you see in 2007, 2012, 2017, 2022, where they get most of their vote in small municipalities. So what's happening? What's happening, or that's the interpretation, and we look at much more granular data to explain this, is that basically Sarkozy, Chirac, and the sort of traditional, supposedly center-right, is starting around, in the 1990s and early 2000 to take a very violent anti-migrant rhetoric in order to get some of the vote from FNRN. It works quite well in the cities. So basically, the fraction of the FNRN electorate that was the most anti-migrant in the city, a lot of it is going to be captured by the center-right, and the people who are going to keep voting for FNRN and who, in fact, are going to increase their vote are typically people in small municipalities for whom, the main issue is not really migration. They have very little contact with migrants, and this is not necessarily their main concern in life. One of the key determinants which we are going to find is going to be the 2005 referendum over Europe. So these are typically the small municipalities who vote very strongly against Europe. So these are the Brexiters of France, if you want, who feel very attacked by trade liberalization. So these are typically cities with large manufacturing employment loss, very difficult access to public services. And so anyway, the point we're trying to make is that this electorate, ended up becoming the electorate of FNRN, although this is not at all the historical electorate of the nationalist right. And this sort of became this electorate for, partly for contingent reasons, because the other parties had left them out, or at least they felt abandoned by other parties. Another way to illustrate this is also that the RN electorate, is sort of lower income, but typically homeowners, which are sort of lower middle class. So here we rank municipalities by the fraction of homeowners in the municipalities, because that's also part of what we observe. And you can see that although the RN electorate is as on average lower income, they have a higher proportion of home ownership. So as compared to the urban poor, this also corresponds to a population who maybe, it's what I was saying yesterday, they have more difficulty accessing, universities or large public infrastructure, education halls, but it's easier for them to have upward mobility through home ownership or, having a small business. And now, if you look at this electorate just as, describing them as nationalist or fascist, I mean, you can do that if you want, but I think you're completely sort of outside the language and the aspirations that they have in mind. And so I think it's very important to try to understand the socio-economic cleavages, the different material aspirations that you have in this different electorate. There will be a lot more to say about this, and I'd be happy to show more. One last graph, Simon, if you allow me. I don't know if this is a good news, but that's if we look at the fraction of the variance of the vote between municipalities that we can explain with our socio-economic variables, this is today the highest ever. So what do you see on this graph? What I'm saying is that if you just put the size of the agglomeration, whether you live in a small or large agglomeration, and your income and average real estate value and proportion of homeowners, you explain up to 60% of the variance of the vote today in France between municipalities. If you add the proportion of migrants, you go to 62 or 61%. So the proportion of migrants, is really not a big explanatory power, whereas socioeconomic variables, so it's social class, but it's what we call in our book sort of geo-social class. So it's a combination of territorial class and social class. And if you put the two together, you have the highest explanatory power ever in French election. So the idea is that, social class does not matter anymore to explain the vote, and that this is all about post-truth politics, stupid populists versus reasonable people in the center. I mean, this whole view, I think, is just completely wrong. I think political conflict today, like in the past, is about complex, divergent socioeconomic interests. Now, these socioeconomic interests are multidimensional. Aspiration to home ownership, education, different kind of occupation. So putting together, different lower class or upper class from very different background is complicated. But in the end, this is what we need to do. So summing up, the left-right class cleavage is very complex and fragile historical construction. You need to put together, lower class voters and upper class voters on the other side into the same coalition, irrespective of geography, sector, origin, religion, gender, which requires very powerful, unifying ideology and platform. And so this is, I'm not saying it's easy, in any way, but, this is what was done to a large extent in the 20th century. And if we keep having this sort of multiple elite, structure of the political conflict that we have today, I don't think that we are going to solve the structural political problems that we have to solve. So thanks a lot for your attention. I have planned too much material, sorry.
No worries. Well, thank you very much. How appropriate that we are here. This lecture has been the one that's most focused on politics. And here we are in the Union Society debating chamber where students flex their muscles in terms of politics. But we've had a lot of excellent history here, showing us really what you get by combining very good, rigorous social science methods with real history. I've certainly learned plenty about France. I could just, while people are collecting, we've got 2 microphones, roving microphones, so put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question and we'll get the microphone to you so that it can be recorded. Good, I've got plenty at the moment. So I won't say anything, we'll go straight to questions. I saw one right here, yes.
Hi, thanks. Thanks so much. Yeah, this is really great. I've been working with some of these books and some of the data that you've put together, and so really appreciate the interventions here. I think it's really powerful the way you've been identifying, especially the stuff today about these cleavages, these new cleavages about education came up yesterday, and the territorial aspect. Right, and I think these are so important. I think the research you're doing is great on it. It's borne out in a lot of other places too. It's not unique to France at all. The geographic story, as people may know, fits here in the UK very well with Brexit vote, for example, and the US Trump vote. But so my question is about how you see that linking up to the kind of story you were telling yesterday about looking, there the emphasis was on looking back to a post-war model that was focusing a lot on inequality between, say, the top, sort of class-based equality kind of inequality model, right? And maybe adding in some things about gender, maybe adding in some things about the racial inequality, perhaps, but not a lot about these 2 huge cleavages that you're identifying here as so important for the politics, right? And it seems to me that it's just, today, so much of the political story is that the far-right parties are campaigning every day on what they describe as these inequalities between people who have been to university or haven't. Not only who gets into university, right, but what about all the people who haven't gone to university? And then their economic life chances, going for when they're half the population or more, so, right? And the geographic element, so the difference between, London and seaside towns in Britain or parts of more rural Britain. So I just wonder, do you see the way forward there for people who care about this movement for equality? Do you see that as going more back to a general sort of class split language, or do you see a place for a way of talking about these specific inequalities that could be more egalitarian, more left-leaning, and not only leaving them to the far right who's talking about them every day?
Would you like to give your name? You don't have to.
My name's Chris Mextroth. I'm here in the history faculty here in Cambridge.
Well, first, let me think that, doing this work, writing this book with Julia, has made me thought about lots of new issues which I had not thought about before. And so, it's not as if, I have all the answers, and it... It is true that in my previous research, all this territorial dimension, geographical dimension is pretty much absent, partly because it's not visible in the data sources I use, partly because I was just not maybe aware that this was so important. And just, the way we worked with Julia on this book is we had took years and years to collect the data, then we just tried to see what we have in the data. What are the most interesting irregularities, and what was striking was the evolution, the U-shape of this territorial cleavage. And so we started building a story on this, but it's just because this is what came out. And so we were not planning it in any way. So now it makes me sort of rethink many of these issues, and I think indeed. So we tried to offer some analysis in the book to show that, in the 20th century, these territorial cleavages were addressed by political parties in many different ways. So including, of course, the left parties historically in the late 19th century, early 20th century were having difficulties with the small cities, rural. But then there were efforts, for instance, the spread of public services, schools, postal office, medical services, roads, in all over the territories, and all these territorial dimension, played a very important role. And I think in recent decades, this clearly has been neglected. So, we talk a lot about the issues of, access to hospitals, access to medical care. But I think, this is related to what I've talked yesterday. So, if you keep the total tax revenue constant that you put to health and education, it's going to be difficult to confront this territorial inequalities in access to public services. So you need to put more resources, but you need to show to people that you do it in a way that is territorially fair. You have also the issue of access to property, which I think the left needs to take more seriously and with less disdain than, Karl Marx in 1848 would say, okay, these are all these petit bourgeois aspirations of peasants who want to become landowners, but we don't care because they will disappear and everybody will be in the urban proletariat in the long term. Okay, you can say the same today if you want with the people who want to have access home and say that, they are causing climate change because of their home and because of their car, but, that's not going to help solve any of the problems. So you have to address this. Let me give you an example. In the last French presidential election, Marine Le Pen made quite an incredible proposal, which was so there's something in France called the zero rate loan, where basically you can get up to 100,000 euros loan, interest-free, to purchase a home. Well, in fact, now it's 80K. She wanted to propose it to 100K if you have at least 3 children. But no, with 2 children or more. But then what she added is this incredible addition, is to say, okay, if you have a third children, you stop reimbursing the loan. So it's 100K you get, which is, so everybody on the center right told her, but, how are you going to pay for that? This is like 30 billion euro because, if everybody takes it up, it's a capital transfer of 100K. So, it's almost the universal inheritance I was talking about yesterday. And so I was a bit puzzled that this was proposed by Marine Le Pen. And so now what's the right answer to that? Well, first, of course, Le Pen and the RN is not paying for that. Because they don't want to increase taxation on the rich, so they claim that by attacking migrants and cutting welfare spending for the idle poor, and especially for the idle poor with foreign origins, they will gain all this money. But of course the math don't add up, and in fact they don't have the money. So you can say that. But I think it's not enough. I think it's important that the left on this kind of issues, takes the issue of access to property more seriously. Look at, I'm not saying they should have a universal inheritance right away. I think maybe access to property to begin with has to be related to access to home ownership or creating a business. I mean, I would prefer it to be much more universal and no string attached, etc. But I think the way things work is that, even in land reform historically, you don't transfer right away the acres of land to the propertyless. You sort of ask them to take a loan, interest-free loan, and then you forget about the loan 5 years later or 10 years later. But you try to construct it as an operation of which looks a little bit like acquisition of private property by making. I'm not saying that's good. that you have to mimic the sort of effort logic of property acquisition rather than getting inheritance as a poor children, just like a rich children, which I would much prefer in the very long run. But in the meantime, you have to see. So anyway, that's a kind of practical policy discussion which I think should not be neglected. And if you only talk about the racism of Le Pen or Bardella, which is of course true for some of the leadership of the party, but for the voters, I really don't think this is the main issue. And so if you only talk about this, I think you're dead, and they get in power very fast.
Great. I've got a question from Chris Clark. I've got a question. I'm afraid I don't know your name. We'll see whether we have more possibilities after that. So, Chris.
Thanks for this fascinating lecture. I mean, my question really relates to a study that was done by a German historian called Jürgen Falter of the Nazi vote in the late Weimar, in the Weimar Republic, especially the last years of the Weimar Republic, and the crucial year 1932, and then the March elections of 1933. And Falter, to everyone's surprise, although he did very complex, with a huge team of researchers, they did very complex ecological regressions. They tested for the size of commune, for income level, gender, age, all sorts of things, territorial cleavages. But what they discovered was that the single most important determinant of voting behavior in respect of the NSDAP was religion. And that interested me because I thought about that when you showed that picture with Charles Tilley's study of the Vendée. I mean, there is enormous literature on the Vendée, and Charles Tilley's, historical materialist account is one rather atypical utterance within that very large historiographical landscape, which has lots of ways of talking about what happened to the Vendée, a lot of which try to make sense of identitarian factors like religion. So I was wondering, given the prominence of socioeconomic cleavages in your analysis, do you think that there is still a place for identitarian factors like religion, or are you wanting to push them back, or where would you place the limits of the kind of hermeneutic that you've been offering us today?
Okay, very good question. And if we can get back to the slides, I will be able to show you a graph on religion. So I get an excuse to show everything I wanted to show. But about the vote for NSDAP, so you're saying it was mostly the religion was the most important factor. So the most. In what sense? In what direction did it go?
In the sense that Catholics were much less likely to vote Nazi than Protestants.
Okay, Protestant. But so the big issue was Protestant versus Catholics rather than no religion, because at the time there was no religion. Yeah. So what we've done with religion, we basically vote for the right and Catholicism. So basically, we have different indicators of religious affiliation. Complicated issue, as you know, to measure. So on this particular graph, we look at the proportion of young girls going to Catholic school, because this we observe very well throughout the period. We have other indicators. In particular, one famous indicator is the proportion of priests who refused to sign allegiance to the constitution during the revolutionary period. We have different measures over time. But basically, the bottom line is the most Catholic place vote for the right. That's for sure, more for the right than for the left, historically, even after controlling for size of agglomeration, controlling. So when I say après tout control socio-demographic, it means after all control socio-demographic variables, so controlling for income, wealth, etc. So you have a strong Catholic factor, but it has sort of disappeared today. So, today, there's nothing left. If anything, it even goes in the opposite direction. But in fact, today, the thing is that, it could also be that our indicator, which is private school attendance, now has all to do with income and sort of your willingness to avoid the public school system, and I think very little to do with your Catholic faith or not. Now, when we look at origins and migrants, this is what we get. So here we look at the 10% municipalities with the largest proportion of foreigners with respect to the other. And so they always tend to vote a bit more for the left, partly because they are more working class, poorer. But even after controlling for the proportion of working class, etc., they still vote a bit more for the left, except you see in the 80s, 90s, where the proximity to migrant seem to have actually an impact on voting for FN and RN a bit more. But then this is going to change over time, maybe because the positive socialization effect of being in proximity to foreigners, you learn that they are not so bad after all, whatever, but the socialization effect seems to matter more than the negative effect, or at least that's the way we try to interpret. And so you are sort of back to the historical pattern where historically the migrants were more Italian, Spanish migrants, which were actually promoted by trade union and left parties a lot more than the new migrants from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, which trade unions and left-wing parties have not been very good at promoting, and maybe that was part of the reason why you had this crisis in the 80s, 90s, where proximity effect led more to RN vote. But this has sort of been overtaken. I mean, I'm not saying the issue has been, set completely, but at least you don't seem to have this effect. And today, the RN vote is really more related to the absence of migrants. So, it's related to small municipalities where you just have no migrant, and this has stopped to be the key issue. So, if you look at the vote for RN with respect to the proportion of migrants, so here so you see initially in 1986, 1993, the municipalities with the largest proportion of migrants will vote more for what we call here la droite nationale, the nationalist right, which is FN-RN, whereas today it's the opposite. So it has completely changed. I mean, that's partly related to the rural-urban shift, but this is even true after controlling for the rural-urban shift, and here this is controlling for the rural-urban shift. So this is not saying identity conflict, religion conflict are not important at all, but what we find is that they seem to be much less important than the socio-economic variable related to home ownership, access to public services, unemployment shock, something maybe I didn't stress and I didn't realize. I mean, I think all geographers and many people already knew that for a long time. But what I didn't know is that, the fraction, manufacturing employment in France today, and actually it's been like that for the past 20 years, is a much bigger fraction of employment in small cities than large cities, which of course historically it was the opposite. Historically, manufacturing employment was in large agglomeration. But the pattern has completely reversed starting in the 70s, 80s, partly because actually it was sometime a deliberate business strategy or political strategy to try to set up new manufacturing plant far away from the big trade union mobilization of the large agglomeration going to small cities, partly because land was cheaper to set up big equipment. It was a different kind of business, so more sometimes agricultural agro-business or warehouse, which are more closer to the turnpike intersections, or but far from the large agglomeration. But anyway, in the end, and also the first wave of loss in manufacturing jobs, which happened in the 70s, 80s, was more the manufacturing jobs that were close to large agglomeration. So in the 1990s, 2000, 2010, the manufacturing jobs were more concentrating in smaller municipalities, and this is those who were most strongly hit by the China shock and the trade globalization of the 1990s, 2000. And I think that's very important, this different level of exposure to international trade. So it's not that the urban poor... Yeah, I'm going to take a different question, you're right. Let me just conclude here. It's not that the urban poor are richer than the rural poor. In many ways, some of the urban poor are actually poorer than the rural poor voting RN, but they are more in the services. They work in shops, they work in hospitals, in care occupations. Sometimes they're cleaning jobs. So, it can be terrible working conditions, very badly paid, sometimes less well paid than manufacturing job in small cities, but much less exposed to international trade. And so in the end, they still trust the left more to care about labor legislation, independently of their origin, than the people with manufacturing jobs more exposed to trade competition in the rural sectors. Okay. Sorry.
Would you like to ask your question? And give your name if you want to.
Hello, I'm Claire Collum, Professor of Land Economy and Urban Studies, and French and British, and so very interested in your comparison. My question is about the resonance of your book in the context of the very simplistic debate that were very powerful in the French media that you know very well between France des Villes, France des Champs, bad metropolitan elite, and the work that also was promoted here after the Brexit vote. So what kind of reception did your book have in the context of this very fraught public narrative that you now have two Frances pitted against one another, which is a very simplistic reading, obviously? Because in a way, we could do a pessimistic reading of your findings as adding a layer, and I'm not suggesting this is what I think, but adding a layer to this, and we know it's been captured by far-right parties, for example. And there's a parallel with what's happened here with the David Goodhart reading of the Brexit vote, with a lot of discussion between the French geographer I'm referring to, that I won't name. So I would be interested how, in that sense, your book and your argument, how you've used this to counter this very simplistic narrative and add a layer of complexity.
Yeah, well, the difference is that, we stress a lot that, it's not as if all the poor voters are rural poor. You also have lots of urban poor. So, within each side of the country, you have a different, lower class voters, which are all, disadvantaged. And in many ways, the poorest of all, tend to be the urban poor with much more difficulties to access housing because of very high housing prices. And so it's not the big difference with some of the statements which are trying to say now, okay, well, all the poor are in the rural small cities and this is the extreme right got them all. That's not at all what we're saying. In fact, if you look at the complete map by income, the left, so just to this is the vote for Mélenchon, Macron, and Le Pen in 2022. This is with individual level survey. In fact, the poorest income groups are actually voting more for Mélenchon than Le Pen. So it's just that one is getting the urban poor, the other one the rural poor. So it's not. So it's a very different view to the sort of simplistic view that all the poor or the working class have shifted to the right. It's not at all the case. It's much more complex. And the other point that we're making is that the aspiration of the rural poor in terms of access to public services, access to high-paying jobs, sometimes more protection from international trade, to some extent, can be better addressed by the left than by the nationalist right, which now in France, and I think it will be partly the same in Britain, we'll have to build alliance with the rest of the right in order to govern, and we'll move toward, very conservative economic policy. So I think we need to accept the idea of moving towards this new kind of left-right party system, and to be concrete, I think in France now FN, RN has to unite with the rest of the right and be part of the right in power, rather than keeping them outside the system. In fact, is the best way to get them in power on their own one day. And at this stage, in the end, they are not so different. If you look at their practical policy platform, they are not so different from the rest of the right-wing party. And I think we have to get out of this sort of this three-party system, sort of three-partition system that we have in France right now. I think is by far the worst of all. The worst of all situation. So, but it's a very it's a very unstable situation, to say the least.
Next question from Alexis.
Thank you so much. One thing you said is that the voters know they know how to recognize their party, and one thing that explains how voters recognize their party is obviously how they get information about their party. And one big difference, at least in the time I've lived in Britain and France, is the media, the structure of media is very different. The tabloids that exist in Britain, at least, didn't exist at the time in France. I don't know how it's now. But this is a very different way of getting your political information and seeing also how voters align with specific parties. So historically, obviously, this is complex, the rise of the mass media in the 19th century. So what's the place of the media in that story historically and then in the future? Because clearly if you have a larger concentration of ownership of media and that aligns with specific political structure, then how is that voter going to identify their own interest?
Yeah, no, that's certainly one extra source of complication. And I'm not going to downplay this, deny this, and Julia is very much into media finance and political finance in general, and will certainly agree with you, and I agree with her by definition. But what I want to say is that it's always been a little bit like that. So 100 years ago, the media system, and at the end of the 19th century, was in a way, even more captured than it is today by powerful financial interest. And so we should not stop. That should not be the end of the discussion. We need to take this into account. That's for sure. But I'm not sure this is worse than I think in the end, the sort of forces of mass mobilization, will find. So they were able historically to develop their own, newspaper, sometime in relation to trade union, to political parties. Today and in the future, it will take different form, but it's already happening. You have lots of people who get informed not through tabloid or through national television, but through new form of online media, which I certainly don't want to idealize, but which are there's some innovation going on now. Of course, political parties, new form of citizen organization, trade union, have to invest energy into this to develop this new form of information, and that's difficult. But I think just to take an example, which also brings me back to the previous question about the reception of our book in France. We got a lot of attention within the Mélenchon party, LFI, partly because, Mélenchon and Ruffin in France have been with another member of parliament from LFI, well, now he's left the party, but anyway, could be the next candidate of the left in 2027, or at least that's what he's trying to do, to try to unite LFI with Socialist Party, Green Party, etc. And one of the big differences with Mélenchon is that he's really trying as much as he can to try to reconcile the rural poor and the urban poor, and so he loved our book, of course, and Mélenchon was very afraid that Ruffin will take the book entirely for him, so Mélenchon sort of pretended that he loved the book as well. But then after, the book came out, the sort of sad story, for the book it's not so important, it's more, of course, for the world, is that the book came out a little bit before October 7, and so Mélenchon and Ruffin were sort of fighting and competing to try to get the book to them, and maybe this could move a little bit Mélenchon into the Ruffin way, although I'm not so sure. But then after October 7, the line of Mélenchon and LFI in France has really been, okay, we should do only political mobilization in the direction of the suburbs and the young voters who are very mobilized about what happens in Gaza, which I can understand, but it sort of exacerbated the cleavage, the sort of identity cleavage, and in fact what we find in our data, which is really quite sad, is that in 2024 we have the biggest gap ever. So you see the red point in 2024. What this means concretely is that the left, and it's particularly the Mélenchon list in the European election, has become more urban than ever. But they have lost basically all their rural vote, which in fact historically they were not that bad, because what's very strange is that they were the party which in 2005 were against the yes to the referendum, and so they had actually some support in small cities, and now they have become sort of the most urban vote of all. So I think, and to go back to your question, Ruffin is also someone who's trying to develop. He was a journalist initially, he had a newspaper, and he's trying to develop sort of forms of communication to the broad public through, documentary movie on working condition, typically for low skilled workers. I mean, it's not perfect, whatever, but he's making a lot of effort, to sort of develop new tools of communication, which, if we want to be a little optimistic, I think there are possibilities in this direction.
Two more questions. Right, we've got two people who've been patient, I'm afraid. Is likely to be the last. One here in the front, and lady in the middle. Is that right? Was it you who put your hand up? You didn't put your hand up. Oh, sorry, yeah, okay, it was you. Yeah, I know. I was aware there was someone in the middle there, yeah. Okay, go.
Great. Well, thank you for the fascinating talk. My name is Daniel Droulet. I'm the president of the Global Young Entrepreneur Society. I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on the growing political divide between young men and women and the potential implications of that, and also like how in the past, like more men would go into higher education now that divide has flipped, right? And the implications of that, and also if you had any, well, we don't have a lot of time, but practical policy suggestions for policymakers on how to tackle inequality.
Are you happy to take the two?
Oh, okay, yeah.
Would you like to ask your question? Do you want to write on?
Yeah, maybe.
Exactly.
Thank you for the fascinating lecture. I'm an economic geographer, so I can't be happier to see this material. My question is follows up on the previous question on the role of religion, and clearly, like your evidence is very clear on the decline of religion. But the question is then, what is the role of cultural issues, of issues on post-materialist values? Beyond you mentioned the issue of ecology, but I'm thinking about gender rights, which seems to gender rights and also to post-materialist issues that seem to be very much driving the cleavage, urban-rural, but also between a conservative. So where does that stand vis-a-vis the socio-economic cleavage?
And I think I made a mistake. Was it you who had your hand up, in fact? So we'll have 3 questions, and this will be the last one. So you ask yours as well.
Okay, I'll try to be concise. Actually, I had a twofold question, one of which related to globalization, but you did touch upon international trade. You did say that actually, this crisis of the left is not experienced everywhere in the world in the same way. And my theory is that it has to do with the level of development as well of countries and with the shift of certain economic activities. And since you've got this graph on, it's fascinating to see the connection with agglomeration. And I know you might not have solutions, but actually we face what economists say we have to keep supporting agglomeration because that's what drives GDPs of countries. And then the rest of territories which are not as productive, but they do have voting rights. So how do we sort of overcome this usual narrative within economists or economic theories that effectively we draft economic policy according to where productivity is without going into the post-growth narrative and we tackle also the kind of political problems that we have in most of the Western world.
Okay, thank you. And did you want to give your name or not?
Yes, Stefania Fiorentino, Associate Professor in the Department of Land Economy.
Okay.
Okay, so thanks a lot for this question. I wish I could answer all of them, but I have only very incomplete and unsatisfactory answer to give. Gender inequality. So there's and gender gap in voting. There's a long-term shift, where women have turned from right to left, basically. So historically, when women start to vote, some country in the early 20th century, some interwar period. In France, very late in the day after 1945. But so in the French data, in the 50s, 60s, they vote a lot more right-wing than the men. And this seems related in the survey to religion, in the sense that if you control for what people express in the survey in terms of religiosity, attendance to mass, etc., the effect disappears. Now, that doesn't mean that religion is a true cause, because it could be also that religiosity itself is related to many other attitudes toward, the values of the patriarchal society in general, and sort of acceptance of the specific role of women in household. So, that's not, but that's what you have in the data. Then over time, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, they turn left, even controlling for other factors. And today, in a country like France, it's just in the continuation of this. It's not completely out of line. So in some other countries, like in the US, with the Trump election, the gender gap to the left has taken proportion which we had never seen before. So it's also in the continuation of previous trend, because this trend of women moving right to left is everywhere in Western electoral democracies since the 50s, 60s. but with different magnitude. And so it's true that in some countries, so here I think there's a Trump effect, which is quite obvious, but you know, there's certainly a Me Too effect where, you know, the issue of gender equality, you know, has become very big, but again, in the particular case of France, it's a bit bigger today than it was 10 years ago, but it's more in the continuation. And sort of, I think it expresses sort of structural, you know, transformation from the, you know, the sort of acceptance, more or less, as a choice of the patriarchal model to you know, to a very different agenda in terms of gender equality today. So this brings me to the question of post-materialist value. I'm not sure gender inequality is a post-materialist value, and I always have a problem with the notion of post-materialist value because I think what we call post-materialist values are always related to some kind of materiality, and you know, the climate is about material issues also. So, you know, this distinction. But let me answer to the question. The short answer is that, you know, we don't have the data at the municipality level, and we don't have historical data at the municipality level to look at values the way we would like to. So we cannot fully answer these questions. When it comes to attitudes toward environmental policies, I think one finding which I want to show, and I always take an excuse to show you another graph that I didn't show you before, because, you know, I am still very excited with this new data, is that if you look at the vote for a green candidate, it's a very urban vote, historically in France. And so in France, you know, we have an ecological candidate in 1974. This is one of the first ecological candidate in the world, you know, René Dumont, who get a very small score, you know, like 1-2% of the vote, but very urban. And you can see, you know, Jadot was the candidate of the Green Party in 2022, still very urban. If you look by income, it's actually pretty well off. So this was the case for Dumont. This was the case for Jadot, well, except for the top 1% municipalities. So the top 1% municipalities are a bit afraid of the green, probably because they ally with the left, and so they are a bit concerned. But if you take away the top 1%, it's actually rising up until the top 5% in municipalities, which is really an anomaly as compared to the history of the left, because for all other left parties, it's always declining. Always. Including for the Socialist Party, which, you know, some people on the left view as like a very centrist party, but in fact it's always declining. Not as strongly as for communist vote or LFI vote, but it's always declining. Green Party, it's always increasing. And so here I think you have a problem. So yeah, you could say, well, you have a problem in the sense that, yes, this participates to the difficulty of having a class cleavage today. Now, you could say that's because post-materialist value in favor of environment policy, you know, that's something that only the rich can afford, etc. But I don't think this is the explanation, because I want to show you another vote, which is the Trotskyist vote, which, you know, in France, we have two competing Trotskyist parties, you know, LO, Lutte Ouvrière, and NPA, Nouveau Anti-Parti Anticapitaliste, which used to be called LCR, Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire. Now, I'm not telling you about this only because my parents were LO militant in the 70s. That could be a reason. But because these parties, actually, when you put them together, they actually make 5-6% of the vote in every presidential election since 1974, which is roughly as much as the Green candidate. So, you know, it's not uncomparable in terms of share of the electorate. Except that they have a completely different profile. So very rural, small villages. These are not neo-rural as far as we can tell. You know, we look at data on a change in population, newcomers in small municipalities. No, these are just people living in small municipalities who typically, so maybe they are the real green voters, you know, the real ecological voter, you know, in the sense that they talk a lot about extractivist capitalism, etc. And you could say, I mean, if you look at them from very far, you could say, well, they are close to the Green Party. You know, they are sort of, again, capitalist extraction, and maybe, you know, some voters sometimes hesitate between the two. But overall, these are not at all the same electorate. These ones are very rural, very, very rural, and they are very poor. These are all only poor municipalities, so, they are very left. So basically, if you're in the top 1%, you don't vote Trotskyist. If you're very poor municipality, you do vote Trotskyist. So, people recognize this, and, I think that's what's sort of beautiful with the granular data we have, is that we're talking about very small votes. They make a few percentage of the vote. But with the 36,000 municipalities, we're able to see where this vote is the strongest in a way which, in a survey, you would get 20 Trotskyist voters and, there's nothing you can say at all. But here we are able to see, and so what this means is, so why do they have this very different profile as compared to the ecological vote? Well, maybe because they talk a lot more about class conflict, and they talk about redistribution all the time, and they talk about the rich and the poor all the time, and the rich of the poor sort of see it. Whereas the green, they just forget completely about class conflict, and they do as if the environment was a sort of different planet where, class conflict does not exist and everybody is equal. So I think here we have a problem, but I think the problem is with the Green Party. I don't want to idealize the Trotskyist party, who have big limits in their platform, although, they're advocating also for the socialist United States of Europe. They are very internationalist in a way which I tend to like. But, there are lots of limits in their platform and their ability to form a majority coalition and get to power in France is close to zero. So, that's not going to solve our problem. But still, what we can learn from this is that there are different ways to address ecological issue and the different critique of capitalism that can be made, and then you get different electorate. So that brings me maybe very quickly to the last question about GDP and, large agglomeration. So, I'm not too much a fan of maximizing GDP growth and share of population in large agglomeration. That being said, in the long run, the view that, the share of population in large agglomeration should keep rising for the various reasons, including related to the transportation and housing, and where you want to limit pollution related to car transportation and extension of building all over the country. You can make a case that the fraction living in large agglomeration should keep rising. Maybe not so much for sort of GDP, but more for environmental reasons. But the thing is that this, in any case, this has to be done in a way that takes into account, the different territorial situation, and that takes into account, the fact that, you have people, in small cities, who are trying to live, a different kind of lives than people in large cities, and they have aspiration. You should take into account these aspirations, and you should stop. Basically, you have to move away from this, Marxist 1848 anti-rural rhetoric, which I think is still a big danger. Was a big danger for the left at the time, and paved the way for Bonapartism also in a way in France, and is still the same danger today. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Well, everybody, we've learned an enormous lot, particularly about France today, and I invite you to all say merci to Citoyen Piketty for everything he has told us.